So the master plan is a set of statements, including maps and reports and studies and diagrams that give legal standing to implementation ordinances. They set forth a policy and a vision for where the city wants to go as a community. And basically, in short, the master plan is sort of like it's a compass point, or it's a roadmap, or a blueprint. I like to think of the compass point because if you imagine you're in the ocean, you can't see anything, but you have an idea of where you might be based on what you can see around you. You pick a compass point on the horizon, and you go in that direction, in the direction that you think you want to go. And as you approach the horizon, you learn more. You can see more at that point, and you can chart course corrections and can ultimately get where you want to go. So what the master plan is not is a legally binding document. That's kind of unique in New Hampshire. There are other states where the master plan is a legal document. It does have the force of law. That is not the case in New Hampshire currently. It does have the ability to recommend regulations that ought to be adopted to help carry out the master plan, but it doesn't enact those regulations in and of itself. Also, it's not exact. It's not a specific route to get where you want to go. It's sort of, as I said, it sort of picks a point on the horizon, and exactly how we get there is to be determined on the ground, based on the actual regulations and different laws. So in that sense, it needs to be flexible. The master plan is not a zoning ordinance. It's not a zoning map. There's a lot of confusion about those two things. The master plan is very high level. It's very generalized. If you're flying over a community at 10,000 feet, you can sort of look down and see which areas are predominantly industrial or predominantly residential. But it's not. That's as much as you're getting in the master plan in terms of land use. Zoning ordinance is a regulation. It's on the ground, and it's very specific and detailed allowances and restrictions on how you can use your land, setbacks, height, different uses, those kinds of things, lot sizes as well. And it's not, the master plan is not the end-all, be-all. It's not a panacea for every specific municipal problem. Again, it's a tool in and of itself to be used by the community, by the administration, to help address those problems. But if you don't understand, if the plan is not understood by the community, or if it's not being used right, or it's not being used at all, then it's not worth much. So that's part of the importance of why we want to help people understand what it is. The purpose of the master plan is set forth in the state law. Again, it is the duty of every planning board to prepare and amend from time to time a master plan for the community. There are lots of different things that a planning board can do. This is the only thing that a planning board must do, is work on the master plan and adopt it. And the point is to set down as clearly as possible the best and most appropriate future development for your community. Master plans can encompass somewhat less than the entire community. In some cases, they might go beyond the boundaries of your community if there's a school district that overlaps or a fire district, for example. But again, one of the other purposes is to help aid in the designing of ordinances like the zoning ordinance, like the subdivision regs and the master plan, create the actual regulations that will have the force of law and help implement the goals of the master plan. And then it guides the planning board in the performance of its other duties, which is to sort of oversee the development of the community, hopefully with principles of smart growth, sound planning, and wise resource protection. So again, I'm sort of repeating myself, but it's very important. Again, the master plan is a very powerful tool. The city of Lebanon, I think, uses it more. I'd like to say we use it more completely and more thoroughly than most other communities in the state. A lot of them do a master plan and pop it on the shelf, and then 6, 10, 15 years later, they do another one. We're using ours on a daily basis. I know the city council uses it for budgeting decisions, capital planning decisions. But again, the master plan allows the community to assess where it is and look ahead to where it wants to go and sort of map out goals, map out directions for how to get there. So properly done, it should describe how and where and why and at what pace the community develops. It provides guidance to local officials in making budget decisions, in devising and passing ordinances, capital improvement budgeting, zoning, site plan, subdivision regulations. Lebanon also uses it. Every different department in the city uses the master plan in crafting their annual work plan. So they set forth in the early spring what it is they intend to work on for the rest of the year and what they'd like to work on for the coming year. And they find connections to the master plan for every possible action that they'd like to take. Not every department has direct action in the master plan. Finance and human resources, for example, there's very generalized statements about wanting to be good stewards of the fiscally responsible for the community, retain good employees, those kinds of things. But there's not a lot of detail for certain departments. There's quite a bit of detail for the planning department in the master plan. Again, it's a long-range vision. It generally looks out anywhere from 5 to maybe 20 years. The current master plan for Lebanon was approved in 2012. It looks out 18 years to 2030, at which time we would look to revise and rewrite the master plan based on what we know at that point in time and where we want to go from there. And again, I mentioned the master plan is not a legal document, but it is the legal basis for several other documents. For example, you can't have zoning without a master plan. You can't create a capital improvement program without a master plan. You can't have growth management policies without a master plan. You can't even have historic districts without a master plan. So it is the guiding policy document for lots of very important things that the community wants to do. Lebanon's master plan. Lebanon's history of master planning goes back more than 60 years now. The first one was adopted in 1957. It's been updated a handful of times since then. The current master plan was adopted in March of 2012. It was actually subsequently amended a couple of months later when we got the energy chapter was completed and adopted as an additional chapter, number 13. That it was the result of more than 4 years worth of effort, starting in the summer of 2008, going all the way up to the summer of 2012 to get that document to go through all of the community inputs, the community forums, fora, surveys, online, lots of different chapters, subcommittee work. Every different chapter in the master plan had its own subcommittee that met on a very regular basis and worked through issues about their chapter, and then review and public comment in front of the planning board and the city council. So it was a very long process. It was quite a bit of public engagement, public input through that process. And Lebanon's master plan, as I said, there are 13 chapters, and I've listed them there. There's only 2 that are actually required by state law, the vision, which we call our introduction, and then the land use chapter, chapters 1 and 2. All these, there's up to 15 other chapters that a community could choose to have in its master plan. The ones that we don't have are coastal management, natural hazards, regional concerns, and then implementation. And that implementation, the missing chapter on implementation has actually been kind of an important issue for us because there's been a lot of concern that we're not using it properly, we're not using it at all. And so we've been, after the fact, now 6 or 7 years later, we've been having to go back and talk more about implementation and track the progress that we've made. An implementation chapter in and of itself would have helped us sort of follow along much more quickly and easily from the very beginning. But I'm going to let Rebecca talk more about that. The last thing, in terms, I mentioned that the planning board, the only thing they have to do is prepare and amend a master plan. The other thing they have to do is to promote interest in it and understanding of it. And as I said before, if nobody understands it and nobody understands that it's how it's being used or whether it's being used correctly or being used at all, then it's not really worth the paper that it's printed on. So that's the most important thing that we're talking about now. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk more about what we've been doing over the last year and a half to facilitate and better understand and better make public what it is we're doing with our master plan and how we're using it.
You mentioned that one of the sections that there is a regional section. Is there any particular reason for that? It seems like the Upper Valley is a pretty cohesive area, and it seems like that would be important to have we fit into the whole region. Or was it really just kind of bigger in scope?
So the question was, why don't we have a regional concerns chapter in the master plan? I don't have a specific answer. I know that the Regional Planning Commission itself has a regional plan, and we fit within that. They match everybody, all 26 communities up into and knit those different chapters together. Why we didn't specifically have one, I guess it's, we definitely have issues like traffic. Route 120, for example, is a regional issue for us. But we're addressing those in other ways, and I guess for the moment we're allowing the Regional Planning Commission's chapter to stand in for us.
Isn't there a sustainability principle that actually talks about the city working with nonprofits and businesses and also reaching out to organizations around? So that it seems to be embedded in that. I think it's sustainability principle 1, to work with others and not just be a silo.
Correct. The very first chapter of the master plan, I think you've got all or at least part of the master plan has been provided to you. In chapter 1, which is the introduction, it's sort of the overall vision, you're right. It does talk about a couple of guiding principles. One is the residents first policy that was adopted by the city council, and the other is the sustainability principles, and there are 7 different facets of that. Rebecca might get into that a little bit, but we could certainly talk more about that. You're right, there are throughout all of the chapters, housing, transportation, among others, there are recommendations and specific actions and strategies for regional coordination and partnering with the surrounding towns or advanced transit or vital communities or on whatever the issue is. But the idea of partnering is definitely there.
I'm going to stand back a little more so that I can flip through my pages. If you have trouble hearing me at any point, please let me know. Raise a hand. I know Pat won't be shy. Yes. My name's Rebecca Owens. As Paula mentioned, I'm the associate planner. I've been with the City of Lebanon for going on a year and a half. My background is more in sustainability management, but as a systems thinker, this all goes hand in hand. And as David mentioned, I'm going to talk a bit more about how the master plan is being implemented, not necessarily the purpose of the master plan, but feel free to let me know if you have questions as we go. So, let's put paper here. Okay, so among all the content in the master plan, we have 5 main tools to help implement it. And I would say divvy it up, but sometimes a recommendation in the master plan requires a multi-pronged approach. So some things might be part of the work plan as well as the CIP. They should go hand in hand. And then also apply to subdivision regulations. So of those 5, we have the capital improvement program, department work plans, chapter outcomes that are not any of the other 4, so something that's like a partnership or education or things like that. And then, so those are the non-regulatory actions. And then we have the regulatory actions, which are the zoning ordinance, subdivision regulations, and site plan review regulations. And these are the things that without a master plan, you can't have at all. So they refer back to each other. Let's see here. So one aspect of the master plan is that we do update it through time. And I'm a little turn around here with my slides. Some pieces are ensuring standardization. So we have the zoning regulations and things like that to achieve the philosophy of the city, but other things are more of the non-regulatory items that allow for more flexibility and creativity. Because in 2012, when this was published, we didn't necessarily know what the future years would entail. So while trying to achieve this vision, we need to remember that there's some things that can be a standard part of the framework, but there are things that also need to be changed through time. And let's see. Should have a clicker here. And to that point, the master plan itself, I don't know if you have this page in your handout, but it does discuss amendments and updates a little bit. And to kind of break down how the chapter outlines apply to that, when we talk about changing or updating the master plan, of the 4 sections in a standard chapter, which include vision and purpose, issues and priorities, existing conditions and trends, and future challenges and opportunities, the first 2 are things that more or less won't change with an update. These are the types of things that we studied really hard, that these are from the ground up, what the community decided through really extensive engagement processes. And we want to kind of stick to the vision and issues that we set out with in 2012. But some of the other things do change. Conditions and trends change over time. Our housing needs, our demographics change. So while the master plan includes great information about that, we do need to have sub-plans through time that help bring our information up to date. And then in turn, so those can help address our future challenges and opportunities. And then the 5th piece that's not shown in the outline here is, I think what you all have is the summary of outcomes that each chapter has at the end of it. And that's really a critical piece as well. So in terms of that, this should look familiar. This is just one example from one of the chapters. And the breakdown of this is you'll typically have 2 to 4, or even in some cases more than that, outcomes that serve as the buckets for strategies. And under each strategy, there are in turn actions that can address that are part of that strategy. These are what we tend to cite in our department work plans and CIP proposals. These are the connections to the master plan that David mentioned. So these are probably one of the most utilized components of the master plan. That said, it's always helpful to go back to the main text to see what they meant, and because they could be interpreted in some ways, so they're not the end-all be-all by any means. In addition, a lot of these overlap with each other, but not just within the chapter, but with other chapters. So when the master plan was first established, those who were involved with it decided it might be helpful to create 16 themes that outcomes from different chapters could be categorized in, because say you wanted to do an economic development plan for the city. Well, the farmers market, which is described under the recreation chapter, is part of economic development, but it might not be necessarily part of the economic development chapter. So you'd want to refer to multiple chapters, and by already categorizing some of these actions and strategies according to theme, it's a lot easier to find these synergies as you're moving forward with these sub-plans, economic development plan and whatnot. So one thing that we don't stick to, again, flexibility is important, but is a good guide, is this implementation schedule. It goes by those themes, thinking that maybe we'd be most efficient if we try to implement actions that apply to different themes in a focused effort each year. So, and also to help us report on those. So where we're at right now, in theory, we would be focusing on the downtown plans, and we are. We completed the downtown visioning study for downtown Lebanon, and are working toward, in more incremental steps, a similar outcome for West Lebanon. But other things like open space, right now we have an open space plan under development, and there were a lot of studies that went into that. So while those pieces were pulled together in earlier years of the master plan's tenure, we're still working on that. It's not that we stopped working on it. It's now that yellow's, and now that some of those pieces are done. It's whenever there's an opportunity that arises, we're going to try to tie back to strategies that are ongoing. A lot of things don't have a clear beginning and end, they're ongoing. So to talk a bit more about the implementation, I mentioned that we studied the trends, the current conditions of the city. A lot of this is in chapter 1. But implementing means that we continue studying that and continue defining ourselves and trying to track the record of where we've been and where we're going. Is our population holding steady, or is it increasing? And anytime we have a new study, it should have that type of data so that we can not necessarily have to go back and update the master plan, but that it lives somewhere. Chapter 2, land use. This is our future land use map, just as an example. This map and other aspects of the land use chapter really define what types of uses and where we want to see more residential growth, are we balancing rural and urban character well. It helps to lay out what are some of the things like mixed-use development that we want to work on more that could continue to be defined. And you don't see the same color everywhere. We're a diverse community. Every type of use deserves a home. We don't want to totally get rid of all industrial uses. That's an important part of our economy. So when someone comes and proposes something in a colored area that doesn't necessarily include their use, maybe there's another area in the community that would be more appropriate. So the future land use map helps us when we're looking at zoning and development proposals and updates to the zoning to have a central reference that doesn't change as much through time as zoning might. Zoning is a bit more fluid. Chapter 3 talks about the central business district, so basically downtown Lebanon. In recent years, and before my time here, a lot of that focus was on what the vision for downtown was. Most recently, the council approved the revitalization of the Mall Tunnel. That was pretty much the biggest outcome recently. And that'll help not just downtown Lebanon, but to connect the community better to West Lebanon through the rail trails, and also move us closer toward implementing the overall downtown vision plan, activating the waterfront and so on. The downtown or Central Business District rather, chapter gets into parking, it gets into density, it gets into the mix of uses we want to see, it gets into open space planning and streetscapes, it talks about the arts a little, so not all the arts and design topics live in that chapter, some of it is in here and so on. Similarly, Chapter 4 for West Lebanon Central Business District talks about, where do we want to see the denser development. It has a rich history. A lot of focus in the outcomes that have been achieved in recent years have been on economic development, so adoption of a revitalization tax relief incentive program, and designation of the downtown as one of 6 economic revitalization zones by the state. And we've also started to allow dwelling units above the first floor commercial uses. And finally, we have completed parking utilization studies for West Lebanon, but as we move toward a planning charrette, as it was approved by the most recent CIP, some of these things will have to be reviewed again just to make sure that conditions haven't changed. What was known during the last study needs to be verified again, and the longer we wait, the harder it gets with some things. Obviously, Westboro is a critical piece of any West Lebanon Central Business District planning. And that's a whole nother presentation in itself, which I will not get into. Chapter 5 is natural resources. This is really the realm of the Conservation Commission, and something that we look at on a regular basis for development review. Not necessarily the recommendations in the master plan for natural resources, but the outcomes that have been implemented through it. So, for example, a riverbank protection overlay district, if a property is in a district near a water body, it would be outlined and it'd have to go through an extra layer of review. The master plan itself doesn't show where that line is drawn, but it recommended that tool be developed. So it was. So we can cross that off the list as complete. That's something more tangible as complete. But there are other things that will continue to change with time and technology. We recently, and now this is a bit more part of the energy chapter and what LEAC does, but have been working on lighting standards. And one of the impetuses for that is not just energy efficiency, but the effect of lighting on circadian rhythms and wildlife. So there are a lot of crossovers between these chapters. Other things that fall under the natural resources chapter include wildlife corridor crossings, stormwater management standards, or at least reference to low impact development, and that we should be staying on top of best practices for stormwater management. And also, how do we incorporate conservation design into developments? We have pretty clear standards now that weren't there when the master plan was adopted for planned unit development, for example. So encouraging development in the most appropriate places while preserving other areas to conserve that have higher value for wildlife, water, and so on. And economic development. This is mainly the realm of our EVAC committee, Economic Vitality Exchange. And economic development does stem a lot from what tools are enabled through the state and federally, but we can also offer local assistance. So this snapshot just gives an example of the economic revitalization zone that I mentioned as a tax credit. Recently, the city adopted a TIF, tax increment finance district, and we'll be further fleshing that out and having a separate group working on exclusively that TIF for the downtown. So that's been a major recent progress in implementation of that chapter. We've also, within the downtown visioning study that I mentioned back in chapter 3, some of that chapter 3 outcome content relates to redevelopment. So the economic development chapter says more of things like, where do we need the economic development, like Miracle Mile, places like that. It also mentions the airport and the airport master plan. That is a major undertaking. So, you know, someone might see the recommendations for the airport in this chapter, but really now their core reference for anything airport related should be that master plan. So again, an external reference. Originally, the concepts were in this chapter, and now we have these additional, you could call them addenda or so on, to be aware of. And then there are other things that are a bit more qualitative that are in economic development, so not everything's a hard science. So we know that beautification and aesthetics and preservation of rural character all contribute to the community's value. And then a hot topic right now, Chapter 7 covers housing. We do not currently have an official authority under the city's umbrella assigned to housing, but that doesn't mean that progress hasn't been made on certain fronts related to it. We work closely with many regional and local partners to better understand current conditions, outreach meetings, getting up-to-date data. There was a recent community conversation hosted by the Chamber of Commerce, Vital Communities, the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission, and the City of Lebanon in November. So we're getting a better handle on that and do expect some more formal city organization around it in the near future. And as I said, in the meantime, some of the major updates that weren't necessarily spelled out in the master plan are provisions for accessory dwelling units. How many of you know what those are? So these are big because it enables someone with a house maybe to have an apartment over a garage that's not attached to the original building. So that can double the density, how many people are living on a single family lot, basically. When we talk about the demand for housing, this gives a lot more flexibility for communities, and it's been a strategy nationwide, not just here. And Portsmouth's a good example. Other aspects of housing that I think I mentioned before, that we've been trying to encourage more mixed-use development. So not necessarily having siloed development. You know, okay, here's commercial, here's industrial, here's housing. And that's traditional zoning. You separate uses, but mixed-use development encourages more of like what we were talking about with West Lebanon, which is, are you going to allow for residential uses above ground floor commercial uses? Are you going to have maybe even live work spaces? So that type of diversity of development helps housing as well as other things like transportation. If you can walk to where you need to work because it's maybe in the building next door as in a mixed use development, that reduces infrastructure needs in many ways. So we are working actively on housing, and again, there are many other studies and meetings that aren't mentioned in the master plan, but come out of the recommendations of it. And one thing I should mention quickly is that as I keep mentioning, like the airport master plan and these studies and things like that, one of the endeavors that we're working on, I'll mention a little later, is making a master list of all these studies and policies and plans. Right now, they're really scattered. Some aren't mentioned in the master plan at all, and that is something that, as we become more familiar with how many of these things are, we want to make sure that everyone's looking at the same, most up-to-date information. Chapter 8, Community Facilities and Services. This is why we have lights on and water running. Our Public Works Department handles a lot of Chapter 8, everything from our water treatment and wastewater treatment and solid waste, to our roadways and telecommunications. Our combined sewer overflow or CSO projects fall under this. That's been an activity that's been going on for a number of years now and really takes a lot of resources and it's a big focus, but at the same time, our public works staff and engineers, as well as our Lebanon Fire and Police departments, they work on a variety of many other things. And we have partners too, like, again, this applies a bit more to the energy chapter, but more and more, we're not just talking about getting electrical service, but having grid service that serves many things. So whether it's electric vehicle charging and solar tie-in to utilities and just provision of traditional power, more and more we're having to have integrated services when we look at community facilities. Am I short on time? Sure. Sure, yes. I wasn't sure I was doing on time, so if I'm good, okay. Yeah, so this, at one of the recent Chamber of Commerce and partner events, there was a scientist, I believe from Dartmouth, who's a geographer, I think, who studied some of the patterns of how people move in our region and across the state, because located where we are at the crossroads of New England, we get people coming here from Vermont, we get people traveling from north. There's just not, there are a lot of job opportunities. We're a job center, and we don't necessarily have all the housing we need here. So this graphic shows what our inflow of people is. So this dark green arrow all the way on the left is those who are employed outside, or who live outside of Lebanon and are employed in Lebanon. There are about 15,000 people who come from outside of Lebanon every day and use our roads. They work in our buildings here. Their employers pay the taxes and so on, including Dartmouth Hitchcock, for example, a huge employer. And so those 15,000 come in, while the light green arrow on the right, about 4,000 residents work outside of Lebanon. So that's the outflow. So on any given day, we have a lot more people who are in Lebanon than actually live here, again, paying taxes and so on. And maybe David had some more to add to that.
I think Rebecca's hit that on the head. The numbers actually come from the most recent American Community Survey,
Okay.
which is part of the census. But it's showing exactly what you're saying. There's about 3,600 people who live and work in Lebanon. That's the round circle. There's another 4,000 that live in Lebanon but work outside of Lebanon. They go to Hanover, they go to Concord, wherever they go. And then there's almost 15,000 people that live outside of Lebanon but work in Lebanon. So again, that's a significant part of the daytime population that swells to 2 to almost 3 times the resident population of Lebanon. As a job center, we are the hub of the Upper Valley, and so we have police and fire and roads that support a much, much larger population than the residents who are here paying taxes to pay for that. So it's a major issue for the city. It's also, you can dive into the details of that, but almost 3,000 of those 15,000 that come from outside of Lebanon are coming from at least 50 miles away. So they're coming more than an hour to work, maybe at the hospital, maybe on 12A, who knows. That goes back to the housing issue. If we had more housing, perhaps some of those people might choose to live closer to Lebanon for their jobs, where their job is located.
That brings up a point that I was sort of wondering about. Is there a lot of data on how far people are traveling or how they're traveling to get to or from Lebanon, or how far they're going within, for instance? So like we live like way up in the northwest corner, about as close as you can get to not being in the city anymore. And Jack goes a mile to go to Dartmouth, but somebody could go, if you were commuting, say, to the business district, you'd actually be having a much longer commute than you would.
I don't know that it gets into the details. I'm not sure how much detail it provides for people who live and work in Lebanon, but from outside, for people who live here and work out, or vice versa, it does get into the distances and it gets into the direction. So it shows it shows less than 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 50, more than 50. And it also shows the dominant direction. So people coming into Lebanon are predominantly coming from the southeast, up 89. People who live in Lebanon but work out are predominantly going north to Dartmouth College, Dartmouth Hitchcock, Dartmouth College, I guess. So all of that detail, the website is called On the Map. It's associated with the census. This data is actually from 2015, I believe. That's the most recent year. So even that is now 3 or 4 years old. So we may have even more jobs and even more commuting.
Yeah, so for us to get to, say, DHMC, we'd actually have to go up to Hanover and back down. And I wonder how that would then show on that map. Is that a circle, or is that going out and flow around?
Well, I guess if you live and work in Lebanon, it doesn't necessarily factor in the route that you take. It's just sort of basically everything within Lebanon is within 10 miles of each other. Almost, I think, measuring the corner to corner, it's not that far. So again, you can dive into that on the map website and get all the details, much more detail. It gets into the different jobs, categories. There's age categories, lots of information there.
So I was going to ask, of the 19,000 or so that work in Lebanon, what percent would be DHMC?
Dartmouth Hitchcock is around when we checked last year, it was about 7,500 people at Dartmouth Hitchcock.
So less than half.
Less than half. But a big number. I think it's the largest single employer in the state.
And I mean, as with any aspects of our presentations, you can, or if you don't already have, get our contact information, and we can share like the website that David had or anything like that. So chapter 9, this one this is loaded for me. I do a lot of work with our pedestrian and bicyclist advisory committee, and also with advanced transit. And our patterns of development depend a lot on where transportation facilities are and what types of transportation there are. This one image is depicting just one or two types, rather, routes for people who are walking and biking, and potential future routes around the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center and Centera Business Park areas. We have a lot of great existing facilities, but there are always new needs for connections that make our travel patterns more efficient, and also reduce the use of single occupancy vehicles on our roadways, because in turn those are impacts that we all have to fund. So the more people we can get out walking and biking, the better, but realistically, and especially as we have that large number of people coming from outside of Lebanon to work here, recognize that you can't always walk or bike. So there are a lot of recommendations in the transportation chapter. Some of the things we are working on, or we're partway there with a complete streets policy, for example, was adopted by City Council in 2017. And this policy pretty much describes what types of modes and speeds and traffic calming, and so in terms of modes of travel, walking, biking, bus, and so on, are appropriate for different types of street areas. So if you have a local neighborhood street, you're probably not going to have a bus stop on it. But if you have a slightly larger street, like High Street or Muskoma, that the local roads empty into, that's where there will be more people, and then you can start thinking about the larger modes of transportation, whether it's buses or whatnot, and having sidewalks as much as possible where there are higher speed traffic and higher volumes of traffic. But as a policy, and I think this is important because policies don't always have teeth. They might get adopted, but until they're in the regulations with specific technical details, a lot of them are advisory. So we in Lebanon are really good with our CSO projects and whatnot at making sure that we're adding sidewalks wherever physically possible. And it's not always clear cut either, but that's one of the ways that the Complete Streets policy is getting applied. Ideally, and what we're doing now is reviewing ways to have some of these specific Complete Streets practices integrated directly into the regulatory tools, so the site plan regulations, for example. Other aspects of transportation, we do a lot of work with the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. A lot of the roadways that go through Lebanon are state roads, Route 120, Route 10, Route 4, so on. And we can't always necessarily do what we want to do just because of who manages what. But on the other side, we also get really good funding at times, like Transportation Alternatives Program, or TAP, not necessarily called grant, but funding to help support local match funding that's available typically through the CIP process to implement projects like the current one, which is shown on this image, Lehe or Lehar Drive. We're working on the design, and later in the year we'll work on the construction bid for a multi-use path connecting Centerra Business Park to the medical center. And as the medical center continues to expand and the area around Centerra expands as well, there's more and more need, and already current need, for dedicated facilities off the road for walkers and cyclists. We also are partners with a number of organizations that tackle transportation much more specifically than we do. We do not have transportation engineers on staff, for example, so we work a lot with our Regional Planning Commission and our Transportation Management Association, talk on a weekly basis, if not more, with Advanced Transit, which provides free bus service throughout the region. And then we also provide feedback to the state and their 10-year plan. So, for example, if you've read in the news about the roundabout that is planned for High, Muskoma, and Mechanic Street, that's partly through funding from the state. It's a very long-term process. It's only one phase of 4 to address improvements along Mechanic Street. And meanwhile, there's CSO projects going on all around it. So transportation is one of the most collaborative themes that we have, I would say. And one of the really fun ones, our Recreation and Parks Department is pretty much the one that spearheads Chapter 10. Obviously, there are many community groups like the Muskoma River Greenway Coalition that have supported what the city's recreation staff helped to implement. And a lot of it has tie-ins, as I mentioned before, to economic development. So the farmers market is managed by our recreation department, and it's recreating, but it's an important economic piece as well. Lots of partnerships with schools and youth, the CCBA. So constant active programming, and they ensure that we have wonderful parks and facilities in those parks, like the Pat Walsh ice rink, and serve all age groups. So from very young age to teens and camps to savvy senior outings. And one of the most recent projects is the installation of a updated playground on Colburn Park. So that was a partnership, a lot of community fundraising. Nothing happens overnight. Similarly, the Muskoma River Greenway was recently extended from the downtown and improved, and it's really accessible. Hope to continue extending it. There, in terms of in the spirit of collaboration, some Dartmouth Thayer engineering school students have reached out to the city, among other stakeholders outside of the city, to investigate how we can extend it even more through West Lebanon, potentially to White River Junction. Right now, there's no clear solution for how that'll occur, so it'll be really interesting. You should mark your calendars, because I just found out, I think Tina can confirm, that on March 6th, these students will present to council their final report with some of their recommendations and findings about that extension. So really, as Paul Coates, our director of the Recreation Parks Department, likes to say, the Northern Rail Trail and Muskoma River Greenway are corridors, like transportation corridors. They're not just recreation, as the chapter's title might suggest. They're really critical spine to the community. We don't have any dedicated facilities going east-west for people who walk and bike that are safe. So this is really the best thing that we have right now, and hope to have continuous improvement, more accesses off of it, and so on. And then we have some members of our Heritage Commission here tonight, the books. And Chapter 11 speaks to historic resources, which the Heritage Commission meets about on a monthly basis. Some of the recent outcomes achieved under that have been a better understanding of our community's historic resources. So in 2016, a comprehensive survey was published that documents what some of the historic assets are, the architectural character of those, as well as recommendations for future work to further define what we have and help preserve it. And there are probably 100 projects that could come out of the findings in that. So have to slowly chip away at that. And one of the types of resources mentioned in the survey were mills. So most recently, Lebanon, which is a certified local government, or CLG, which is something that the Division of Historical Resources from the state administers and provides funding when you apply successfully. They enabled us to do a study of the water-powered mills of Lebanon, which is a lengthy, really lengthy, well-documented study available on the website under the Heritage Commission's resources. Lots of photos and recommendations specific recommendations for how to preserve those. So out of these more general comprehensive studies, starting with the master plan, you get the historic resources survey, and then you get more granular with specific assets like these mills. The Fountain Working Group, Lebanon's also known as the City of Fountains. They've really contributed to the character of the community and just announced an anonymous donation to help them restore the Glenwood Cemetery fountain. So that's been an exciting thing for them to continue their work on. Also, I would say the most significant focus presently for this Heritage Commission is the Dana House. And the Dana House is located just up the hill on Seminary Hill, right next to the old school where the school district offices are. this is a project not just of the Heritage Commission, but also the Historic Society, which does this a large amount of work in the community. They and other partners have, over the years, conducted more consultant studies than I can count, but we're working on consolidating the recommendations from those because this is pretty much one of the oldest, well-preserved, with a lot of work to do yet, but still remaining houses from the late 1700s, even though it's been relocated. There's a lot we can learn from and activate educational programming in it. So that's one of the big goals of the Heritage Commission right now. And then, if you've been following the news, we now have an arts and culture commission that stemmed from an arts and culture task force recommendation to the city council to establish, and we're really glad to have them because Chapter 12 has a lot of great things, and we're not just talking about aesthetics and art. We're talking about music. We're talking about dance. So many different pieces that already are part of the city, but how do we further promote them, and how do we make that materialize, and not just as programming, but as part of our architecture even. The downtown visioning study talks about an arts walk, for example. How do we integrate that into our streetscape? And then, for example, the Greenway has sculptures. There's a sculpture contest. So all these topics are not standalone. There's room for all these elements to complement each other. And finally, the more recently adopted Chapter 13, which focuses on energy. And this is the realm of LEAC, the Lebanon Energy Advisory Committee. Very active group, lots of subcommittee work, for example, with streetlights and converting our current city-owned roadway and parking lot lights to LED, more efficient LED lighting. That also, going back to the conservation chapter, is friendlier to our circadian rhythms. Also, municipal aggregation, which is a very complex topic. Maybe some of you here could speak to that better than I could. We have a new energy and facilities manager who has just taken on so many of the projects in the chapter in partnership with LEAC that the pace of pace of progress in doing energy audits of our buildings and expanding where we have solar, not just on public facilities, but private development projects for community energy, is really astonishing. So that's been a great addition. We also have recently achieved this Soul Smart designation, which David helped with a lot. And this allows this national designation that kind of assesses all of the different things that the city does, whether it's incentives like more streamlined permitting to allow for solar, to where we allow solar and how big can solar be, among many other evaluation components. And the energy chapter goes into more than just solar. There's wind and wood heating, and a litany of other things. So, okay, how am I doing on time before I jump into some of these other things? Okay, Tim wanted me to, no, I'm kidding. He wanted me to go blow right through. Okay, so I'm gonna, oops, I keep hitting that button there. Skip this slide, it's just a recap, and talk briefly about, with all these activities going on, where are we at? Can you say that the master plan's completely implemented at some point? When 2030 hits, are we gonna say, just check off all those boxes and say, okay, where are the new projects? Probably not. A good number of them are strategies that are ongoing. We're always going to have collaborative partnerships. We're always going to need to keep adding more transit improvements and things like that. But there are some start and finish projects and studies and so on. Typically, we've been reporting on about a biannual basis to SCIMP, which is the steering committee for the implementation of the master plan. That's the existing process for kind of sharing where the various departments and boards and others are at with implementing the different outcomes in each chapter. And those are open to the public. Anyone can go, but they're pretty static. So we might look at 1 year and a few examples, and that gets stored in the minutes, and then we move on to the next year. And yes, we build on top of each achievement, but what gap analysis, what things are kind of falling off the burner and so on, there's no single reference to say, okay, this is where we're at. So what we've been moving toward, and this best practice that many communities do, is to have a more formalized reporting process. And also, as I won't go all the way back to that slide, but that yellow chart that talks about the years and when we're implementing different themes, it also shows two windows through 2012 and 2030 when we should be implementing updates. And what an update is, it means many things, different communities. Some communities rewrite each chapter separately. They hire one consultant for one for another. Some just do all the master plan at once. Others just update pieces. Our master plan is still relatively young. So where we're at right now, and I'll get to this in a minute, is a focus on the reporting more than the update. Talked about SCIMP a bit. There are approximately 675 outcomes among those 13 chapters, so on average about 45 outcomes. So again, at each meeting, we can't speak to the status of every outcome. And SCIMP and the planning board, as David mentioned, is the main oversight for the master plan. But SCIMP provides recommendations to the planning board on where they want to see the master plan go. So with the reporting that we're undertaking now, and I mentioned this in brief before, some of the things they want to see is what are the resources coming out of implementation of these actions, so that we can have an aggregated list. What are the examples? Not just, okay, we said it's complete, it's done. What are the examples? So if you said you have more mixed use parameters now, what's an example of a mixed use project that has been enabled through that? So more examples. And then most importantly, I'll say responsible parties. Master plan doesn't have an implementation chapter the way some communities do. It doesn't say, okay, here's your outcome, you're assigned that, you have 28 years to achieve it. Or 18 rather. So that's one of the hardest things we've had to sort through is we have a rough idea of who or what board or department can oversee the implementation of each chapter's outcomes, but when it comes down to it, it's rarely just one party that's tackling each. So here is pretty much how we've broken it down. I mentioned a few during the presentation, like Energy and LEAC, Heritage Commission and Historic Resources, a lot of city department work. I'm not going to dwell on this right now, but there is a representative or a lead person from each of these boards and committees that we're working on recruiting right now, and they'll be oriented to how to gather up status information from each outcome, and they'll be able to fill out a form online that feeds into a main and aggregated reference that we can then, as staff, convert into an online, very accessible format that shows the status of one of the 675 outcomes, as well as cross-references. So what are some other chapter outcomes that are key synergies with this outcome? And related resources, the main responsible party, and then these last two pieces are mainly the metrics or key performance indicators piece. I don't know how well you can see it on your screen, or maybe in your text there, but these are something optional at this point. We'd like to have some, I'm going to skip this slide, some more work done around understanding how do we measure the performance. So it's one thing to say that we're complete with an outcome, but how do you benchmark yourself to another community? Do you say that a metric is we have the lowest energy use per square foot, and give us that funding, we deserve it? How do you justify or measure progress quantitatively, not just saying that we have an energy efficiency plan or something like that? So we'd like to focus some of the first update work on the master plan on identifying a few key metrics from each chapter, and reviewing what other communities do, so again, that we can benchmark ourselves to them. A lot of communities say, we're the most livable community. Well, what are the metrics that go with that? Or our economic development is progressing, so what are the metrics of economic development, things like that. So the target timeline for defining these performance measures a bit more beyond this single reference throughout the entire master plan, this 9D, 7E, we're looking at the middle of this year to start talking about it with staff and then bringing maybe a menu of examples to the public to review. So that's part of the next steps with the reporting and updates. I mentioned the metrics. I mentioned having these leads or champs for helping with reporting the statuses of these outcomes. SCIMP will provide an executive summary of the first set of reported outcomes in the fall, and then we'll move into next year to see where our baseline reporting is. So, okay, and there are a few more resources provided at the end of this. We can provide the direct links to you following this presentation. So, okay.
Hello. My name's Tim Corwin. I've been with the city going on 4 years. Okay, so we're going to talk about zoning regulations, subdivision regulations, and site plan regulations. Zoning is probably the most powerful of those three sets of regulations. You take a look at the community and you divide it up into districts, and in each of those districts, and we'll get into this a little bit more, you identify what uses are permitted and really what buildings can look like and where they can be located on the lot in those districts. Subdivision regulations, it's about taking a piece of land, dividing it up into pieces, and requiring a public review process and having certain standards for dividing that land to ensure that it meshes efficiently with the existing transportation network that we have, utility infrastructure, and those types of things. We want to make sure that it's efficiently planned. And then finally, site plan review. You're just looking at a single property where you're building a new building or you're redeveloping that property. We want to make sure that whatever's being built there is in compliance with zoning, and that any impacts that it may have on abutting properties are addressed and mitigated as much as possible through that site plan review process, among many other things. There's obviously, if you look at our site review regulations and our subdivision regulations, and I encourage you to do that, at least insofar as you can review what the purposes of those documents are. I mean, the purposes are quite extensive, so I'm only sort of painting with a very broad brush and only hitting on a few of those. So. I like the comfort of the podium, David. I'd like to get back to the podium as soon as possible. But I am just going to follow along with this printout here. Everyone has it. So Of course, all these things are enabled specifically by state statute, and New Hampshire is a state where municipalities can only do what the legislature authorizes the municipality to do. So all these things are highly regulated, although within those particular regulations, there's of course a lot of room for creativity and creating regulations, whether they're zoning, subdivision, or site plan, that fit our community and fit with our master plan. But there are statutory references in here. A lot of this was actually prepared for a different audience at one point. But in case you're I won't review those, but they're in here. In case you're interested, it's very easy to find the statute by doing a web search. But generally speaking, all of these are they're intended to support the general welfare and enhance and encourage appropriate and wise land use as set forth in the statute. So flipping over to page 2 here. And of course, as we've spoke extensively already, and these are all tools to implement the various goals of the master plan. And I would say that probably you could probably make an argument that zoning and lands regulations implement in some respect, some aspect of every single chapter of the master plan, but certainly more than others. Land use obviously is the primary one that zoning implements, but the central business district chapters and a few others. I did want to point out though that if you look at the enabling statutes for these things, they're very they're really geared towards ensuring safe and efficient development. They're not necessarily crafted in and of themselves to speak to things that we care probably just as much about, which are aesthetics and things, and a nice looking community and an attractive community, although there are things in there. But the way that that's handled, I think you could argue, is through another statute, which allows for innovative land use controls. And innovative land use controls really allows you to do a lot more things than you would otherwise if you were just looking at making sure that that sewer will be connected to the site, or that there's proper access. As a community, we're concerned a lot more than just those basic things, although those basic things are very important. So there is a statutory enabling, if you will, to look at these more aspirational goals, sort of from a regulatory perspective, and so we can require things like design standards that might not necessarily have anything to do with safe and efficient access or some of these more practical things. So anyway, there's through whatever statutes are out there, we do have a lot of authority, to get the development that we want to see. Looking at the so we'll do zoning first, and then we'll do subdivision and site review. Looking at the last slide on page 2 there, the purposes of the zoning ordinance are of any zoning ordinance are set forth in the statute, and ours kind of mimics the same language: lessen congestion in the streets, secure safety from fires, adequate light and air. One of the prior to the early 20th century, there was no zoning. Zoning is a development of early 20th century law. And what would happen is go to a house, and anyone or anything on the next lot could be, or I should say, the lot next door could be used for anything. There was no control of that. But what would happen is that if you own a home and your next door neighbor opened up a pig farm, there was an avenue to deal with noxious, impacts. Sorry, come on, people, impacts. Noxious impacts from a pig farm. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to take that person to court, and you would sue them under a tort theory of nuisance. And so you could get a judge to, restrain that activity or damages. But, there's a whole host of problems associated with that. And so, as a community or communities, decided to find a better way. And this is how zoning came about. We're going to prevent those, incompatible uses from ever, starting in the first place. And so the traditional zoning is referred to as Euclidean zoning, and Euclid was this U.S. Supreme Court case that determined that zoning was constitutional and not a private taking or not a taking of private property. And Euclidean zoning is basically you take your industrial uses and you put them there. You take your recreational uses, your residential uses, you put them there, and then commercial here. And so it's separated. And I don't know if anybody's played SimCity, but if you have, that's what it is. It's those three categories: industrial, commercial, and residential. And so for much of the 20th century, that's what zoning looked like. You had those three different areas. Now we take a much broader look at uses and recognize that there's real value in having a mix of uses like you would traditionally have prior to zoning. But anyway, the whole idea is that zoning was originally intended to mitigate incompatible uses. And so so while there's a lot more flexibility today and nuance in developing what our zoning regulations are, that is still one of the main underlying concepts. We want a nice community where we all get along and can enjoy a certain quality of life, and that's what the zoning ordinance is all about. So with the first thing you do, arguably, when you draft the zoning ordinance, is you come up with a zoning map. And the zoning map is going to identify where the districts are. And you can have as many districts as you can think of. I can't think off the top of my head how many, probably have 13 or 14 or 15, maybe less, zoning districts, but it's whatever we want those districts to be. And so we decide, using hopefully the future land use map as a reference, where these districts are going to be. And I did have a slide with the zoning map. It's indecipherable on your handout here. How many people have ever looked at seen the Lebanon zoning map? Okay, so you take a look at it. It's interesting. It's got a lot of different colors. Oh, Paula has. That's good.
But I have a question.
Yes.
How many of you all know what zone you live in?
Oh, that's a good question.
That might be something for you to look up.
Does anyone know?
Residential.
Which?
Industrial.
You live in industrial light, really? Oh. It's unusual. Oh, okay. Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, that's a good. I probably the majority of people here live in the R3 district. That's a very common, but definitely not everybody. But good question, Paul. So we have our zoning map, and then so wherever you live, you can look on the map and see where you're zoned. And once you determine that, there are a set of regulations that are attendant to that. There are only certain uses of your property that are permitted under our zoning ordinance, and that again is a constitutional exercise of municipal power. We can tell you what you can do. The city can tell you what you can do with your property, and in some cases it's arguably very limited. So in the R3 district, it's primarily a single-family district. R3 is the majority of West Lebanon. It's the majority of downtown Lebanon to the west of Hanover Street. R2 is sort of is southeast of Colburn Park. But if there's a use that you want to make of your property, and it's not in the district in the table of uses that we've created for each of these districts, you can't do it. The only way you can do it is to go to the zoning board for a variance, which is not easy to get. So you're limited to how you can use your property, depending on how it's zoned, what district it's in, what zoning district it's in, and what the uses that we've identified to be allowed uses in that district. There are some uses where we say, single family home, you can do that, what I say by right. You don't need any sort of special permission. You may need a building permit to build the home, but that's That's basically it. There are other uses where we say, okay, this might make sense for this district, but there may be some impacts that, maybe some foreseeable or unforeseeable impacts that are attendant to this specific type of use. So let's give it an extra layer of review and require an approval by the zoning board, in which case it would be called a special exception, which is sort of a misnomer. It's neither special nor an exception. It's permitted, but you're sort of subject to certain criteria. If you can demonstrate you meet this criteria, then the board will say, okay, that should work. You're good to go. The other thing you can do, or we do, is identify uses that are allowed by conditional use permit. And conditional use permit is sort of the same thing as a special exception. It's heightened review, but it is administered by the planning board instead of the zoning board. But it's really kind of the same idea. So those are there are the uses that are permitted in your district, and then it's which kind of use? Is it by right, or do you need to go to the zoning board or planning board for a special heightened review? The other thing that you're going to find in each zoning district is a series of dimensional regulations. So we've said how you can use your property, but now we're going to tell you where the building can be located on the property and how big it can be, and among other things. The most common basic zoning dimensional regulation is a setback. So we would say in the R3 district, which again I think probably a lot of you are located in, there's a 20-foot setback from your front lot line. So you got to figure out where your front lot line is, which is a whole other conversation. But if you know where your front lot line is, any building on your property has to be set back from the road at least 20 feet. Same thing with the side lot line, in rear lot line, although it's 15 in the R3 district. So, but anyway, whatever the numbers are, there are certain setbacks. You can't put your building right on the lot line. And again, the whole idea with that goes back to the early 20th century. We don't want homes on top of one another. It's not Manhattan, it's New Hampshire. We like a little bit of room between one another. And so that's the idea with setbacks. Now, having said that, in the central business district, which right now is downtown Lebanon, downtown West Lebanon, we actually do have a zero setback. There's no setback there. There's only a setback from the rear lot line of 10 feet. So you could theoretically have building to building, and that is reflective of the pattern that you see, at least in some parts of our downtown, and certainly in downtowns nationwide. So the dimensional regulations, the setbacks will vary from district to district. It's based on hopefully an assessment of what's there. And where you want to be, and what the master plan has envisioned for this area, and you take all those things together, and you come up with these regulations. Other common regulations, not just common, but they're in all of our zoning districts, limit building height. So in the R3 district, for example, a home can be no taller than 35 feet, which actually could be pretty tall. I think most homes are well under that height, but in the central business district, by contrast, we just raised the maximum permitted height to 55 feet, and we're looking at revising those regulations even further with the downtown design project that I think Rebecca mentioned. So we do building height, we do lot coverage, we actually don't do lot coverage, we do building coverage. So in the R3 district, I think for a lot that has sewer and water, you can have no more than 25% of the area of the lot covered by a building. So that's another way that we kind of control density and, protect the character of these areas and aesthetic values, that type of thing. So let's see. Building coverage, height, minimum lot size is important. So if you're going to, this is only ever really going to come into play for the most part when you're subdividing. So if you're creating new lots, we want to make sure that those lots, again, are consistent with what's on the ground there today. And so each zoning district says you have to have a minimum amount of land area in order to create a new lot. So again, in the R3 district, it's 10,000 square feet. So if you have an acre lot that you want to subdivide in the R3 district, at a minimum, you need you'll be able to get 4 lots out of that. But what you also need is frontage on a public street. And I forget what the frontage is actually in the R3 district. But so to create a new lot, you need basically two things: minimum lot area and minimum frontage, say 50 feet or whatever it is on a public street. So those are the basic dimensional regulations. There are communities, without a doubt, even in New Hampshire, that regulate subdivision and land use far more more intensely than we do. But I would say. So it can get a lot more complicated. There are lots of different ways that you can zone and control buildings and uses. But these are the tools that we're using right now. Let's see, where are we? Lebanon zoning ordinance. So we covered that. So those are the districts. Where's the computer? Is it over here? Yeah, we're almost done with the zoning ordinance. There's a lot in the zoning ordinance. I was interviewed by a wonderful reporter who will remain nameless a couple of years ago, and was asking me about a certain case before the zoning board, and he looked at this person. This person looked at our zoning ordinance. It was just shocked by the length of the zoning ordinance. This thick, document. Well, I think it's about 100 pages or so, maybe more. It's not that long when you look at other communities. Maybe it's an average size zoning ordinance for New Hampshire, but I would say it's on the modest size for most communities. So as long as thick as this document is, and there really is a lot in it, it could be way more extensive and often is in many communities, especially in other states. But here's just a sampling of some of the other things that we do have in our zoning ordinance. One thing that we established, in addition to, you won't see this on the zoning map, so the zoning map is cut into geometrical shapes showing where these zoning districts are, and they're not necessarily contiguous, obviously. You could have an R3 district over here and an R3 over there. But in addition to that, we also have overlay districts where we've identified, unique resources or sensitive resources that need to be protected. And so we established these overlay districts where not only do you have to comply with the R3 district regulations, but you also have to comply with whatever overlay districts apply. And so the four of the most common overlay districts that we have or ones that sort of have the most regulatory burden are wetlands overlay, or riverbank protection, floodplain, and historic district. Without going into too much detail with all those, they do generally require additional approvals, from various land use boards. So, for example, and even state bodies. So, for the wetlands, we've said. We've identified a wetlands protection overlay district. It's a zoning district, and it encompasses all wetlands. And then we also add a 100-foot wetland buffer around any high or very high wetland value. So it's a bizarre looking overlay district. If you ever actually, we have mapped it out. You can go online to our online GIS, and you can click on that feature, and you can see what it looks like. But within that district, which has these crazy lines, it's very limited to what you can do. And those overlay districts trump what the underlying zoning districts might allow you to do. They're more restrictive. And so if you want to do something in that wetland, if you want to do something in that wetland buffer, if you're actually in a wetland, you're going to need state approval, which is a whole process. And as part of that state approval process, it goes to our Conservation Commission, which I guess we'll be talking about probably next time. And in addition to that, on our zoning ordinance, it also has to go to the zoning board for probably a special exception. So many layers of review to make sure that our wetlands are protected, that they're that they're not really being developed. We want to make sure that our drinking water is safe and that our ecology remains intact. And so it's very common to have wetland regulations, and we have them here. Riverbank protection identifies certain water bodies as that. It's always a question. What's the difference between a water body and a wetland? Sometimes there's definitely some overlap, but we identify certain water bodies and water courses in the city of Lebanon that these are that we want to specially protect. and within those areas, it's usually about 50 feet from whatever the water body is. It's use of that area is very restricted. We don't want any activity. We want storm water to go into that area and hopefully sort of get filtered or seep into the ground before it even reaches the river. So these are all ways to protect our natural resources, and we do it through a zoning tool. Floodplain. We want to be really, really careful about building and development and uses within areas of the city that are inundated with water, even if it's only once every 100 years. And so there are fairly strict regulations about that. And finally, our historic district. If I had more time, I would have put if I'd left myself more time, I would have put in a map of our historic district. But I'm sure Becky and Ray are very familiar with that. But it encompasses Colburn Park and kind of the ring of properties that directly abut Colburn Park, and then out on the mall is also a part of our historic district, and to make basically more or less to make any exterior changes to a building in that district, you have to go to the Heritage Commission for a certificate of what do we call it? Certificate of approval. Certificate of approval. So, and again, that's in addition to whatever regulations apply in the underlying zoning district. The only two other aspects of zoning that I wanted to touch on were signs. My favorite. Yes.
Can I ask you a question about floodplain?
Sure.
I was talking to a faculty at Dartmouth the other day, doing work on increased extreme precipitation events in the Northeast. And are you incorporating that contemporary research into your evaluation floodplains?
Our floodplain districts areas have not been reevaluated, I think, since late 1970s. I mean, so it's wildly out of date. But at the same time, were we to update the regulations, the problem, I mean, unless they fixed in the past year or two, because I haven't really been paying attention, but the problem had been, and I think it still is, that you can't look when you delineate these flood areas, you can't look ahead. You can only look back to see what's happened. So there hadn't been, and again, unless this was recently fixed by FEMA, there hadn't been a way to acknowledge that these things are getting worse and to account for them today in delineating those floodplain districts. But I believe you can only look back in time. So that was a problem. It may have been solved, but I don't know.
The Lebanon floodplains are based on FEMA floodplains, which they were like 2 years ago, trying to update, even to use more recent historical data. But there are so many people that have been in floodplains that were not previously. At least I believe you're right that the political will is not there to actually update those floodplains. Yeah. And it sounds like what we do here is follow up with the floodplain.
Right. I mean that's what floodplains. That could be another. And then so there really are a lot of things in the zoning ordinance. Please feel free to flip through it at some point. Like we have a section on sexually oriented businesses, and Dave and I were saying we have no idea what's in it because we don't. It hardly ever happens. I mean, it hardly ever comes up. We have a whole section on alternative treatment centers, which we do have one of those, but we're probably, we're not going to get another one for a very long time. I think that's probably safe to say. So we have sections in the zoning ordinance that it's good that we have it there, but we really don't use it very often. But signs and parking are certainly not two of those sections. We use these a lot. Signs, we just updated our sign ordinance in August and had an important, small but very important update last month. And the idea is that, and this is really this has as much to do with safety as it does aesthetics, but we regulate signs, and anytime you put up a sign, it's going to be, you need to check with the zoning ordinance to make sure what you're doing is permitted. You're probably going to need a permit, but maybe not. But signs is something that we regulate through the zoning ordinance. And then finally, parking, we don't have, there's an argument to regulate parking through site plan review, but for right now, and this was the way that it was done traditionally, you regulate it through the zoning ordinance, and you provide that for any particular use, depending on the size of that use or the number of employees, you have to provide a certain number of minimum parking spaces, and you can see why that would be something of interest to the community at large. We don't want people parking all over the place in unsafe places. But we've certainly gotten a lot more nuanced and flexible as time has progressed, recognizing that we were requiring these large parking fields, and requiring businesses to sort of account for the worst case scenario, Thanksgiving Day. And we're creating all these impervious surfaces in an unattractive landscape. And so we have different tools to account for that now. We have shared parking where your minimum is going to be based on, if you have a mixed-use building and they have different peak hours of operation, you can reduce your minimum parking looking at that. So, but those are quite extensive as well. And then just the last thing I want to note about zoning is that if you can't meet any of the regulations, you can always ask the zoning board for a variance. And the idea of the variance was to provide a safety valve for the community to avoid a takings. So that's in that Euclid case that I was talking about. The objection was that you're taking my private property because you're telling me what I can and can't do with it. So you're decreasing the value and you're controlling it to some extent. And the Supreme Court said no, that is within the regulatory police power of a municipality. Assuming the state government has granted that power to the municipality. But still, there is a concern about takings, and so if there is a property, for instance, that there's something unique about it, that if you could only develop it in accordance with the zoning regulations, you couldn't use it. Like, let's say there's a massive cliff in the middle of the lot, and if you had to put the house within the required minimum setbacks, you couldn't have a house there. It would go halfway into the cliff. Well, that's a great, silly example of a case for a variance, because arguably they could say, well, you've created these regulations that made it impossible for me to use my property. Give me money. Give me just compensation. You've taken my property. And so we allow the variance process as a safety valve to say, okay, your property is unique. We see that it doesn't make sense, or it's not fair, it's unreasonable to apply the regulations, to that whatever particular regulation is to your property. We'll give you a variance for that. So there's that process. Subdivision regulations.
A lot of variance requests.
I guess it's all relative. I would say not really. The zoning board has maybe about 30 applications a year that they hear over the course of 12 months, and maybe half of those are variances. So 1 or 2 variance requests a month, probably on average one a month. I don't think that's.
I know the friend of mine who lived down in Massachusetts had a 1-car attached garage, and I wanted to expand it to 2, and that put him a few feet over the side setback line. Yeah, it made the case that, well, it wasn't an unreasonable use, and I'm in a neighborhood of houses with 2-car garages, so I'm just trying to sort of get in the same parity as my neighbors. Right. And that was allowed.
Yeah. That would be the kind of thing that probably pass muster here as well. So. Subdivision regulations, what a subdivision is defined in state statute. We've adopted that statutory definition. It's very broad. It's any division of land, for sale, usually. That's usually what we're looking at. But also if you create a condominium. So for example, there's an apartment building going up on Etna Road. What's the name of it? Does it have like a... It's not called ICV, is it? Treetops. So the second building is going up, and it's going to be residential units, and it was approved several years ago, but they decided they wanted to make it condominiums, and so they had to come back a couple months ago for subdivision approval, even though they weren't creating any new lots. But it was under the statutory definition, it's considered a subdivision. Again, the idea here is that we want to make sure, but it usually involves creating multiple parcels out of one. And we want to make sure that those lots are served by whatever they need to be served by, that they have access to water and sewer and our transportation networks, that emergency personnel would be able to reach these properties, that they are not, that they meet the underlying zoning regulations, that they're not, configured in these bizarre shapes to make, to meet the technical definition or the technical requirements of the zoning ordinance. So, and all of these things, when they're brought to the planning board or the zoning board, are done through a public hearing, and that's really important because the abutters, the owners of the properties abutting any property that's the subject of an application before the zoning board or planning board gets a notice in the mail of the public hearing, and it's at that public hearing where the planning board or zoning board takes input on what's ever being asked of them, and it's an opportunity for abutters, neighbors, or really any member of the public to express concern or ask questions about the project. And we that's really important because the whole idea is that we're sort of in this together. We have, of course, there's private property ownership. Of course, that's extremely important, but there is a community element to it. There's a community. There's an important community element to what you do with your property and how you use it, and we want to have a community conversation about those. Now, a lot of times there is no community conversation about something very minute, but anyway, it sometimes it can become a months-long conversation. So I got like 5 minutes. Subdivision. David. It's 3 minutes. Okay. It really is kind of a simple idea. For site plan review, you're just looking at a single property, and we have a series of regulations in the site review regs that address what we think needs to be on this site to make it safe, to make it well planned, to make it usable, to make it attractive. And these are things that the site plan has to show. So if you have a vacant piece of property and you want to build a building on it, you're most likely, unless it's a single-family home or a two-family dwelling, unless it's a single-family home or a two-family dwelling, you're most likely going to have to come to the planning board for really permission to build this building. And you have to show the planning board what it is that you're going to do, and you have to meet all the regulations. You have to show where the building is going to be located, what the dimensions of it are, where the parking is, what the lighting is, and we have a whole series of, or we have a whole long list of lighting regulations because we want to make sure that it's well done and doesn't have a negative impact on the abutters. Same thing with landscaping. We want an attractive site. There are a long list of landscaping requirements. So it's got to meet all of these criteria in our site review regulations, and then the planning board reviews that and may ask questions about it. And there may be things that come out at the hearing, maybe from the input of abutters, or maybe just somebody from the planning board raises a question about how it will impact surrounding uses, and maybe there's a suggestion or a condition that the planning board can impose on the site. But, well, we think it's pretty close to a residential neighborhood over here. We think because you're going to have traffic coming in and out early mornings, we'd like to have a buffer, some kind of landscaping buffer between this project. I mean, that's a simple example, but there are lots of things that the planning board can do to make sure that this is a good project that is in the public interest and serves the general welfare. So went really short on subdivision and site plan, but we can talk about those briefly next time too. So. No, that's fine. So, thank you. We'll see you next week.